This making I tore the sight from. You cannot account for the feelings he has for you. The glass speaks of your fat thighs, your sagging breasts, crooked face. Yet when he approaches, you feel a shape of the world taking place. Never have you found such sweet delight in touch. Even though he knows you cringe with suspicion, he rubs your shoulders, kisses near the ear. Never has your skin crawled so happy. Only the well of his young eyes, however, saves you. You know he will one day see and be gone. Eyes are for seeing, yet I tear at my sockets. Years I lost sight of, my surroundings enamored of a woman. She thrust her body toward me deliberately and with malice. I could not retreat, could only succumb. Never, though young, had I imagined such hunger, such laughing thirst. She scratched at my chest, bit my lips, slapped her thick thighs tightly around my body. When I understood this making, I tore the sight from my mind with hatred and died in her throat. She cannot stand, her body brittle and broken. Shards of light pierce her flesh, fester near her breasts. It is the light, she thinks, that steals my memory. Oh, to imagine once again my lover. But her shackles keep her from falling, her arms from rising. She feels nothing except the brutality and white knowledge as her unbearable mind tears open desire.
All right, welcome to another episode of Poets in Montana. Today's guest, you've just heard read a poem from the past, Mr. Gary Lundy. What's that from, Gary?
Well, this was actually a group of poems I wrote while still in graduate school, and my first jaunt into prose poetry.
Okay.
And I mean, I don't need to. I guess I can just. You can see their prose.
Right.
And the story was that it was part of my dissertation, and it disturbed a professor of mine so much that they quit my dissertation committee and sent me a phone message. We didn't have email and stuff, and said my work was sloppy, uncontrolled, hysterical and uncontrolled, sloppy, hysterical, and uncontrolled. And my response to her was, well, my life is sloppy, hysterical, and uncontrolled. And they quit, and it worked out better for both of us, I suppose. But anyway,
sounds like it. Yeah.
It was ended up being published in Boundary 2, a magazine out of Binghamton.
Yeah. So this was when you received your master's
My
at Binghamton.
PhD.
Your PhD.
Yeah.
Okay. What?
I got my master's there also.
Okay. All right. And I noticed, in your brief bio. Well, I mean, and this is such an odd thing to do because Gary and I known each other for a while, and we talk like almost weekly and argue a lot. But I know that you grew up in Colorado.
Yep.
And then did you go to school there?
I grew up in Englewood, Colorado, a suburb of Denver.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated from high school there. I went to the University of Colorado and then stopped going the second semester, and it took the draft a year to catch me. And
what year?
That we're talking, I graduated high school 66.
Okay.
And then got my pre-induction draft notice in 68.
Yeah.
That was an interesting year for me because my birthday is the 5th of April. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated the 4th of April. I believe I've got it right. The 4th of April.
Right.
And I got my pre-induction draft notice the 6th of April.
Wow.
So my 20th year wasn't a particularly happy year.
Yeah.
And
my brother, the same. I mean, his birthday's the 4th. He graduated in '66 and was drafted. Well, not drafted. He joined the Navy to jump the draft.
I did in fact join the Navy after I got that notice.
Right, right.
And that wasn't. I mean, all of it was a cop out. I felt, but
right. And you joined the Navy probably like my brother to avoid going to Vietnam.
I had no idea of that. It was my father suggested the Air Force because he had been in the Air Force.
Oh, okay.
But they had no openings, and the Navy did. And
so you're thinking like flight school in the Navy? Or?
Oh no, just I actually auditioned for a band. I played saxophone.
Oh, okay.
And I was 1 point off of getting into the Navy band.
Oh, okay.
And so then I was on a destroyer for 3 years, and then my last little bit of time I was on a amphibious cargo ship.
Okay.
And
but you did spend time off the coast of Vietnam.
Yep,
Right?
yep. We shore bombed.
Yeah.
And
so were you writing back then?
oh yeah, I couldn't stop. I was told by my senior year English teacher when I shared a poem with her that I had no talent, I shouldn't write poetry, and while I'm at it, she said, you don't have what it takes to go to college. You should go to VOTEC, vocational school, learn a trade, meet a nice girl, and have a happy life. And while she was wrong about having what it takes for school, she may have been right about the rest of it, since I, have not been particularly successful with long-term relationships, except yours, and for some reason I can't divorce you.
All right. Well, how about something in print? You want to read us something? How about?
That was in print.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to read us something else, or?
I don't know. What do you want?
How about something from? Each Room Echoes Absence?
Okay, this is my latest book. It's by Foothills Publishing, and I'm very proud of it. And I'll randomly turn.
There you go.
What I did, I had a collection of poems. My lover, Pansy Bradshaw, died, and this was in part my grieving, but I turned it into the editor really not expecting much, and I was surprised, as you know, when he took it. The poems in my manuscript were one on each page, but it ended up, and I think works better with, it just goes on. They're just one after the other with a
little space break.
Yeah. And so I'll read this one. All of it's just titled Each Room Echoes Absence. This is from the second or third section. Two men kiss publicly, stand on the street. Your soft father voice whispers, that's best kept in private. My eyes linger on the figures. Then up to you, our hands held tightly. I, a mere child. At times the boy talks to hear his own laughter, against the odds of ever rediscovering his lost lover, father. And yes, I do want the thrown away shoes, the ones your dying friend left you. I'm sorry I was unable to help more, unavailable to do more than nod in agreement or mouth a sound of tongue on skin. Were you ever to learn how to listen you'd be a formidable host. Insert design on having to keep safe. A slow fade away, impossible to stop. Try to imagine memory thought, even though language prevents. I need to feel touch once again. Poor pain, residual belonging. Come alive. If only a few more moments. Say ah. Yes, that's it. All the way in. Scratch compliance surface skin turmoil.
A lot of the poems in this collection are those kinds of intimate sort of relationship type poems, because like you said, I guess it was written in response to Pansy. Yeah. But if somebody, you know, if we're going to talk about the kind of poetry you write, experimental, I guess, is a word that comes to mind. It's not narrative. No, it is in a way. That's, you know, sort of it's storytelling. But I know we've talked about your work, and you go in a lot of different places. When did that start? Did you always write that way?
It actually, with that first poem I wrote, it began towards the end of my doctorate.
Okay.
But I've had a number of experiences. But I don't now remember who I was reading, but there was a prose poet that I was reading at the time, and I found that interesting because at that time, we're talking 1984, 85, poetry was pretty much limited to formal lyric poetry.
Right.
Prose was something else, and it was always story. But what do you do when it's short? And so writers were at the time beginning to change the definitions of what poetry could be, and that's what that group of poems that I have in that early work.
The prose poems
was about, and that's what was accused of being sloppy, hysterical, and uncontrolled.
Because you didn't have that line tension going on.
And there wasn't the line breaks.
Right, right.
And that was very confusing then, as it continues to be. I started reading. There's a lot of, this is more biographical than it probably needs to be, but when I got my first teaching gig in Oswego, New York, I met some lovely people, but I had the experience, and my students were amazing, but I had this experience. They had a Canadian Writers Festival, and among the Canadian writers was a Quebecois writer, Nicole Brossard. We've talked about her before. And she had just, shortly before that, come out with her, at that time, most recent book, Love Hers, Lovhers. And she happens to be, identify as a lesbian. I wasn't in touch with my sexuality. In the way that I maybe still am not, but in different ways. But I was kind of sacrificed by the people in charge to show her around, and I think all the men were afraid of her. Again, this was, we're talking 1986, 87, somewhere in there. And I had a great time. What a lovely person. What an amazing presenter and writer. And she wrote in French, in Quebecois, spoke fluent English, of course, but also all her work was written in French and then translated to English. And Love Hers was a translation of the French lovers when it's given a feminine ending. But she meeting her fighting initially with her poetry, which broke all the rules I'd been taught up to that point, really liberated me. But I think more importantly, it raised the question of identity. I think as particularly as a Caucasian identified as straight male, identity is given to us. And it's privileged and it's the best, and anybody who isn't, too bad. Kind of, that culturally our how we're raised. And reading the women I started reading at that point, all of them were dealing with the question of identity. For instance, I was raised that if you didn't know the gender of the writer, you used he. In my essays, if I didn't know, and if it was a name that could, and it never occurred to me that automatically erased 53% of the readers. And I started learning, but in learning that, it forced me to look at me and what I wanted, what I needed. And that's when I started opening myself to the possibility that I wasn't straight. That might explain my failed relationships too. To all my ex-lovers, I apologize. But it's been a process since then and I went on too long with that.
No. Yeah, I mean, and you were married at one point too, right?
I've been married twice.
You were married twice,
Yep.
okay.
To revision the history, I call them discards, which isn't true. I suspect I'm more the discard.
God knows what they call you.
Yeah. May God keep it to themselves. It was of course, when I was young, as so many of us in my generation, you weren't complete unless you were married. And my first wife and I I was 20, she was 19, and I left, we got married, and 2 months later I spent 9 months or less, 9 months in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So, and I used to laugh and say we got along great so long as I was deployed. But she was dealing with her own. We both were dealing with questions of sexuality.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into that. That's
No. Yeah, well, we're all pretty much just blindly going forward at that point in our life anyway, right? I mean, and it's a point of discovery as to what the hell's going on and where you fit in.
It's hard to know. I don't know my experience at that age versus your experience. We all have different experiences. I don't want to level it into...
No, but I'm just saying we're all young and we're all naive and we're all searching for whatever's going on.
We're learning.
Yeah.
And I enjoy how far young people have carried this question of gender, of feminism, of Black Lives Matter. They're insisting on being and paying attention in a way that I was being told not to, that it didn't matter.
Right.
And what's changed in my writing has in part been in the last 4 or 5 years, or since I've been here, I less and less frequently use the personal pronoun I. I use we. I never use, certainly in the last 3 years or 4, I never use he or she, any gendered pronoun. I use them, us, our. In part, I started that because I have so many friends who are gender I forget the term now.
Fluid. Yeah.
And prefer they if I introduce them. And that's difficult. We're stuck in habits. And I found that if I write and use they, it's easier. It's getting easier not to be shocked. Because I measure by clothing.
Oh, we made lots of measurements.
You're a man.
We make judgments based
I'm a
on
man.
observations.
If I had a dress on, I might be a woman. But all of that reduces to the question of genital.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of odd that we want to know. We do and we don't want to know. I laugh and say, I've spent my whole life in coffee shops, drinking coffee, reading, writing, listening to people, not having much to do with conversations like this. And I have never, even when I've seen somebody I find really desirable, thought about their genitals. It's just never come to mind. And yet our language...
It comes to my mind all the time.
Well, of course, but you're a despicable, ugly old guy. But
in terms of your writing, you're reading those poems that you from Each Room Echoes Absence, and the prose poem from This Making I Tore Sight From, and then the stuff that you've been giving to me more recently, the stuff post pandemic, and then maybe more appropriately post cardiac incident.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little bit? I mean, your writing, I think, has changed somewhat, and it seems to have moved to an extent, from my observation. Tell me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, and I'm sure I will be. But it's moved more from the body to the mind.
Yeah, that assumes I have a mind.
Yeah.
When I had open heart surgery 11 months ago, almost, and happily I'm here to be. Unfortunately for everyone listening to this, I'm still here, and you have to listen. But I didn't read or write anything for, I don't know, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. And I'm recovering. Obviously, I'm all drugged up and giggling a lot. I probably would have enjoyed a Grateful Dead concert. But in January, early January, the writing just started again. And I just wrote whatever. My writing for years now has rarely been governed by intention. I remember once trying to write a love poem, and it was so bad. In fact, that poem I read out of This Making began as a love poem. Now that having heard that poem, you recognize my failure. I didn't show it to the person. But I just listen to wherever the words carry. It's like a conversation if you're in an engaged rather than a mono like mine. If we're conversing, the ideas carry a lot of the conversation. When I'm writing, I sit down, I'll be reading something, and sit down. I usually, I'll be at Butterfly or some coffee shop and listen to sometimes in a coffee shop before the pandemic, especially, so much talking that there are like words bouncing off the ceiling and the walls, and I'll sit there and a fragment will come in an ear, and I'll write it down, and another fragment from over here, and I just start creating these fragmentary texts. And I started that as an undergraduate in Denver. I got my bachelor's at the University of Colorado. I returned after the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And I started going to the student union and sitting there and listening to all the words. We're not a quiet culture.
No.
I mean, certainly not when you're in a group. And now I think probably my work has, I was sharing with you yesterday that it seems like I'm writing to my dead self in a curious way. That's not meant.
Not intentionally.
But you were talking about the poet who wrote sonnets.
Right, yeah. In response to the death of someone,
Yeah.
they began writing as a daily exercise,
Yeah.
a sonnet a day.
And the forms are really interesting. I still write prose, but when I started writing back to it, I'd sit there and in my chair, all covered up, as we're talking January, and it just came out 3 words, 3 lines. Occasionally interrupted by 1 line or 4 lines, but 102 pages.
Mm-hmm.
And in my journal, it's 3 words, 3 lines. And I don't know why. I mean, there was nothing conscious in that.
Right.
That was my return to writing.
So right now we talk about what you've been up to over the last year or so, and even before that, obviously the few years before that, and a lot of it was, your attention to it, as you told me, was formally numbers, that kind of an approach.
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to content or where it was going or how it was headed. But mainly, the only thing you really imposed on it was, if you imposed on it, was some kind of a number or structure, whether it's a couplet or a tercet or whatever. And right now you're working on
couplets,
70 pages of couplets and ticking, right?
It's so funny, 72 now.
Yeah. So,
And,
you want to share some of that?
Well, I can dig it out. I would say that in one of Allen Ginsberg's letters or interviews in one of the books since his death that I have bought more recently, don't remember now what, but somebody has asked him to tell people what poetry is, and his response was, poetry is the best language can do. Mm-hmm. Now, I think people have taken that to mean formal and, all of this. But I think kids, you meet a little child, and if you pay attention, if you ask them to share what they're seeing, it's poetic.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And as I've said before, the book Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg, and one example, I believe it's from there, where a child will look at a car and say, look, that car is smiling.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we see a bumper and grill and headlights, and I think we get so serious about what we do. Mm-hmm. And we get serious about what we say, everything,
Yeah. Well, kids obviously have a fresh take on things.
Yeah.
And I've been working with kids now for a while, and they just constantly blow me away.
Yeah.
Yeah, we lose something the older we get.
Yeah. Well, I think we just get so fixed in the minute we walk into a room and don't remember why, or we're a little lost, we take the wrong turn, and everything's new, we're back to childhood.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we get so locked into the formal, the way I drive to park to go to Butterfly, or the way the way you park your car and where you walk. Everything's loaded in its right place.
Creatures of habit.
And that makes us feel as if we know.
And secure.
Yeah, but the minute, haven't you ever, you're looking for a book and you can't find it, but you need to get to it because you were talking about it, and or where the hell is my pen, or whatever, my hat, whatever it can be. We get lost, and in that lost place is where everything draws attention again.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you've referenced Ginsberg, of course, and Nicole Broussard, and I know you studied at Binghamton with Creeley, right?
yeah, I studied with Robert Creeley, and Milton Kessler were the two people that made the biggest difference to me. But Creeley really, and that was another I've shared where I couldn't, when I knew Creeley was coming there to guest professor for a couple of years, but I got his at the time collection, which was through couldn't have been 75, and I'm trying to read his book. I can't read it. It's so odd to me. Again, this is about my prejudices from what I've learned to that point. I returned to it after reading all these other books for my doctorate. I couldn't put it down. Same thing happened to Broussard. I loved her work. I couldn't read Love Hers. It was so new to me. Now, that's not to say that it's new, but to my sense of what poetry was, that initially I couldn't read it. And Creeley was one of the early, Creeley and Olson really changed my whole, up to that point I'd been, even though discouraged from writing, was always told you needed this, you needed that, you needed, and Creeley was a lot less that, as you know if you've read him, but a good teacher, and he was the beginning of my change. And interesting how that happened.
Yeah. No, I mean, we're lucky to encounter people like that. I mean, they shake up your way of thinking, and of course, I mean, and then over time you learn that what you like today may not be what you like tomorrow. I mean, we change with however we feel when we get out of bed in the morning, and what we're able to read. And the more you read, the more you're open to reading more. And so I think that helps.
Yeah, and if you're in love, the things you read are different than if you've just been dumped. I mean, our emotions really
totally
do.
Yeah. Well, share something with something of the newer stuff that you're working on, and or anything else that we want to grab here and
I've been talking
share a
too
piece
long.
of.
Let me see.
Well, what else are we going to do? This is kind of a.
I think. Let me see what I got here. Oh, this is my newest stuff. I was looking for but I can. Let me just read one of these. I'll just.
Read a page.
Yeah, this was on October 19th. Well, let me.
So you were doing like
I've got them
a page a day roughly of these, or
I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 that I wrote on the 19th.
Okay.
But I think I want to go to the 23rd. See what we got there. That's Pansy's Yahrzeit.
Numbers.
Yeah, this is, and I don't know. These are short. They're short poems for me in certain ways, but reuse the already prolific. Reuse the already prolific punctuation borrowed from several favorite reread books, stacked against the walls wearing fabled dedications. Remember when that name meant little and how you found it impossible to read their books. resources can reconfigure melodic orchestration, left only on the scraps of thrown-out notebook pages, that favored dog whose name part of a titillating popular song. Pleasure rarely comes in unmarked packages after all. Unoriginal, waffling carries a dazed group rushing out for lunch or dinner. We'd enjoy some sort of intentional consent given the pliable primary incense smoke, where none other than the absent one faces directly into the flickering candlelight. Boards waxed prior to being put in place for sleep. Too many ailments go unnoticed until it's too late for diagnosis.
Chock full.
Yeah, and then it just came out. Anyway, that,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, things are falling apart.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what I did. If you want, I can find that, get it in the right direction. There we go. Okay. Shit. This is this group of poems is the ones I was talking about,
Right.
and they're all 3 lines, 3 words, and I can just. I think the title is going to be Bride of Omission. We all know death plays favorites. But I can just read the first maybe page or something.
Yeah. Or whatever.
Outside with cane for balance, stomach poking out, for strained attention after open-hearted, slow recovery, never now worried about ritual breathing, unstretched yet carried after medicine swallowed, unregistered return to this a new day, moderately alert in order to catch balance prior to fall, little recourse, insides glued occasional when once reading, feathered the hours, lost in self without doubt or moderation of hospital care, geometry coordinates, and it goes on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but it's completely.
This was right after your incident?
Yeah, this one would have been, I don't know if I guess I don't have the dates on this. But yeah, this one I think was probably, the title was probably the 4th or 5th or 6th of January. Mm-hmm. So my surgery was the 10th of December. So I was closing in on the first month. And, oh, that's fun. I just turned the page and I'm just going to arbitrarily, because what I just, closing in on is the first line of this page. Closing in on finishing reading a book takes on residual broken promises, combing all left still to be said, written forceful, keep hearing knocking on door that's not real, emptiness, the governing reality, jewelry, catchphrases, blue or green, padded lightly purple, earlier spilled sweetener, coffee or worker wiped up clean, an aroma of contraband or temptation, stalled though essential, circuitous, absent fodder. And it goes on.
Language.
Yeah, and I haven't really looked at this since, but it's fun to have that going on.
Yeah.
You know, and that it really mattered to me as it turned out, because
Right.
I hadn't written any. I've kept journals. I am, although nobody would believe it from all the blah, blah, blah of this, I'm really introverted. And I don't work with people well. I don't work poorly, I don't think, but I mean, I'm not the guy that goes to the bar and has a great conversation with everybody or something. I'm at the end of the bar watching and listening, but I've always kept a journal, and that's.
And you you taught classes at University of Montana Western for 20 years.
Yeah, I did that. But I have to say that, I mean, things that people don't know, and this will be familiar to some of the people who have known me, but when I started teaching, I had no intention. I thought I would go back to house painting, which is what I did in Colorado before going to graduate school. But when I would get in front of the class, I couldn't eat before teaching. I couldn't. I was so worried about upchucking that I was hungry, and terrified, honestly terrified. The first 5 years of my maybe more, going into a classroom terrified me because I didn't feel qualified to in any way presume to know what they needed to know. And I think in some ways that probably made me an okay teacher because I was more listening than lecturing, but it scared the bejesus out of me.
Yeah, I'm kind of on that same page.
Yeah.
I taught, high school classes for 10 years.
Yeah.
And then just going in to teach little tiny kids, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. I mean, that even was, I felt, it was odd that you would feel that way. But you just, because you're on, I guess, or something, and you're in front of a group of people, and then, like you say, it's like, how am I going to fail? I mean, but a lot of it is just fear of failure, I suppose. I mean, that's probably what's at the root of it. But for me,
I didn't want to hurt people. I mean, there is an arrogance. I had some of them as professors who know the truth, and you'd better repeat it, right?
Yeah.
And discounted our experiences completely.
Yeah.
And while my experiences in the Navy may not be intellectual, it still informed a sense of being.
Yeah.
And I always laughed out here. The students I had at Western were, for the most part at that point, first generation. Their parents were hardworking, often ranchers, and they knew so much about things I didn't. I mean, I could talk to them about poetry and literary theory and language. I've never put my hand and pulled a calf out. That's amazing. I mean, I say that with respect and really humble, and I'm going to presume that I know what they need. And I did think I do, to a degree, in that broadening our perspectives of how we deal with things.
Right.
And that language is rarely innocent. But
right, but that's I think a lot of maybe it is our generation that came out of all of those changes and upheavals in the middle of the last century that discounted all that top-down bullshit. I know it all, and you do my way or the highway, buddy, and that we discounted all that, and so in a way you set yourself up for then trying to live up to an ideal that you wanted, but you can never achieve in that regard. Maybe that's a part of the fear of the whole thing too. I don't know.
Well, there's fear, and then there's a unwillingness to bend and learn. I have so many experiences with people who have the degrees and maybe their books or whatever, their accomplishments, and suddenly they will not entertain the need to still listen, to still learn.
Mhm.
And there's always more to know.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And I think the mistake we often make as we get older is refusing to acknowledge that young people, like I've said, if you ask a 5 or 6 year old to tell you what they're seeing, it's really interesting. But it's the same thing if you ask a 12 or 13 year old, a 16, 18 year old, etc. At each stage, they see different things. They have different, and it's not to say that it's always correct, but it is to say it's real. They experience it.
Yeah, totally,
So.
totally. The I know one of the little books. You have a couple books that were done by It's a Rose Press, and that's a press. Is a Rose Press. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That you were involved in with the poet Michael Dickel, right?
Yeah.
You want to read something from one of those?
Yeah.
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 Or
I will.
something
Let me put this. I should put this up. I would just leave that. Yeah, I don't mind at all. I like these books because they're so small.
Yeah, it looked like the little pocket series kind of.
Yeah, and this was the. Oh yeah. Oh, this is your book. I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we won't read that. But this was really fun. It was in 2013, and I'll read the first poem.
What's the title of the book?
When Voices Detach Themselves. And you'll see right away where the title came from.
Okay.
When voices detach themselves, when I imagine I am listening to their speaker's sudden impact of invisibility, of having lost the way, even though insistence attempts to sidestep a bouncing young noise, can it be that through thought I confirm my being? Yet does it too precede the thought? Can it not outlast loss? In another location, two people unwind their bodies from the previous night's encounter, move to opposite sides of the room. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
And these are prose poems again. Do you want another one?
Sure.
Because this one I'll read. This is fun. Put a line back in. Right now I have my mouth on your beautiful skin, my hands on your cock. I am loving you with skin, tongue, being into and with your being. It's slow, not methodical, but precise. I take you entire into my mouth, my throat, to languish and fluidly swallow. I hold you. You may cry. Do. Let your fear out. You are safe. I love you. That one, we might need to edit that one a little bit.
Oh, no, we don't edit.
But anyway, you
Yeah.
want something from Heartbreak?
Yeah.
This is called Heartbreak Elopes into a Kind of Forgiving. I don't know what, I'm just randomly opening it. This one was to you too. This is your book too? Or is this
Yeah. Oh, that's my stack I put on the...
It's interesting. I notice I don't know how to spell Mark. I always have
You're not alone.
M-A-K. Not really. My body is no longer illuminated. As a boy, you remember laughing. She dances naked among black and white photographs, photos of another posing. My lover swims against flood water, gasps for breath. Two older men sit upon the canvas acrylic covered. A child's high-pitched voice carries along the wind. Piano notes accompany polite conversation, contrapuntal. When the moon rises above rooftops, when a phone rings in some distance, you will pretend to shave your body into her shape, forgive for a moment age, outside, spring snow, heavy, a wonder, to sing a carol of longing for another. Repetitions, we buy the mask of incompleteness, waver between shadow and light. My lover leans toward me, his lips full, his tongue tipped ripe. The writer dozes off in a large cloth armchair, assured of missing little. You look my way, and a heart softens in Ohio. The writer rests on reputation, like a second language, a further home, lost in the photos, desire to write a consequence beyond childhood. My lover stands in front of me, lifts his right arm above his head, as if reaching for a promise. My eyes languish on his bare chest, muscled arm. Think a minute more before you imagine to speak. Live crushed, too late perhaps, you wander streets empty silence.
Just curious, in terms of form again in these, are these punctuated? These are prose punctuated?
All I use in punctuation is period. It's prose.
Okay.
It's on the page like prose.
Right.
And I use period. If you have don't, I use an apostrophe.
Right.
But otherwise, there's no capitalization.
Commas.
And no commas, just periods. And I didn't read that as, I did pretty well, but I tried to see the periods as line breaks.
Mm-hmm.
I was taught in elementary school that a period is a full pause, a full stop. And so when I'd read this, I'd try to do that. And they're all prose poems.
Right.
Yeah. Some shorter. But
well, is there anything else that you want to talk about or share or anything like that? We're getting close to the end of an hour of shooting the breeze and reading some poems.
I've talked too much. And I'm sure by now, most people who started this are gone. They've made breakfast or supper, or, moved to the ball game.
They may be in the middle of a good nap.
And that would work. That's what I'm going to do shortly. It just seems, we were laughing yesterday. I believe that one of the things missing in American culture, I can't speak for other cultures because I'm not in that. I mean, there's a lot of various cultures in American culture, but one of the things missing is creativity. That in school, at least it used to be, I don't know if this is still, but when you're in the early elementary, you're taught drawing and music, but if you don't show talent, i.e. I had a friend who was kicked out of the art class in 4th grade or something for not keeping within the lines.
Right.
And I remember if a person can't hear the tone, they shouldn't sing, or etc. And it seems to me one of the things missing is the freedom that children have. I mean, anybody who's had a kid with crayons knows you need to get washable because you got to wash it off the wall.
Mm-hmm.
They're just naturally creating stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all need to do more of that. Now, the wonderful thing about poetry versus the other arts, there ain't no money to be made writing poetry. I mean, a successful book, I remember one book, I won't name the writer right now, but sold 70,000 copies, and that was considered a huge success in poetry.
Oh, yeah.
Well, in other friends of mine who are fiction writers, that's like boring, right? And so there's so little at stake.
Yeah.
We should give more permission to it.
Yeah. It's incorruptible.
Well, in that way,
let the tail go with the hide.
It can't be bought.
Exactly.
Okay, I guess we're done.
We are pretty much at the end of our time. So, Gary Lundy, it was a pleasure. I mean, I'll see you again next week down at the Butterfly probably. But
I'm going to find someplace else to go now.
all right, good
But
enough. Next
you.
week, join us for another episode of Poets in Montana. Thanks for joining us. Toodles.
Got a lifetime filled